And now the Old Testament and the parable I warned you about.
This is a reading for Wednesday, and a reading from the book of Judges. Then all the lords of Shechem and all Beth Millo came together, and they went and made Abimelech king to the oak of the pillar of Shechem. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood upon the Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you lords of Shechem, so that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over themselves. So they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' Shall I stop producing my rich oil, by which gods and mortals are honoured, and go to sway over the trees?" Then the trees said to the fig tree, "You come and reign over us." But the fig tree answered them, "Shall I stop producing my sweetness and my delicious fruit and go to sway over the trees?" Then the trees said to the vine, "You come and reign over us." But then the vine said to them, "Shall I stop producing my wine, that cheers gods and mortals, and go to sway over the trees?" So all the trees said to the bramble, "You come and reign over us." And the bramble said to the trees, "If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." This is the word of the Lord.
So obviously from the Old Testament reading, thank you very much, Eileen, it's about trees. And I did say that there are modern stories, modern parables. One of them is one that is very favourite with children. You'll know it, I'm sure you'll know it. It's the one where there are three trees growing up, and one of them has an ambition that wants to be a bed for a king. And another has an ambition that wants to be a boat that carries precious cargo. And another has an ambition that wants to be a statue that everyone will look to and know the truth. And the time comes when they're mature enough that they are harvested, and one of them is bought by a farmer and turned into feeding troughs for his cattle. That was the king's bed. And the other one is turned into a smelly fishing boat. And the last one was turned into plank, which stayed in the feeding trough. And the boat was the boat from which Jesus preached to the crowds from the lake. And two of the planks were nailed together and put on a hill where they held Jesus, and there still is an image in our own minds. Powerful things, parables. And Jotham tells this story about the trees, about how the trees go to the olive tree and say, "Come and be our king." And the olive tree says, "Do you want to stop producing olives?" And similarly with the fig tree and with the vine, and then finally they choose the bramble. I can tell you I know all about brambles because my wife sent me out to do blackberrying the other day, and I think I spent longer taking the thorns out of my flesh than I did picking the blackberries off the bush. But isn't it a powerful parable? So why did Jotham tell that parable? Well, he told it because a king had been made called Abimelech. Now, Abimelech was a pretty nasty character. He was utterly ruthless, filled with ambition. He'd had all his brothers, bar one, put to death. He was greedy. He was in search of power, in search of money. And like a lot of these people, he surrounded himself with warlords. You know, a little bit like you'll see in some countries of the world. You know, these days we'll probably think about a country like Afghanistan or something like that. Surrounded himself with warlords. So when the time came for a king to be appointed, all the warlords got together because they were getting all sorts of advantages from Abimelech. And so they had this greed, and they had ambition for power and money and things like that. And Abimelech was their man because they could do that. And so they chose him to be the king. And what Jotham is really saying is, what a very foolish way to choose a leader. Because you can pretty much predict that if you choose people like that, people who are lacking in morals, people who are filled with personal ambition, frankly, people who don't care a fig about everybody else, that you are going to see the consequences in the way that they behave and in the ultimate destruction of the people over whom they rule. It might be a slow process, but it is nevertheless bound to be true. Choose the wrong sort of person to be your leader, and you will live to regret it. I think it's a very contemporary sort of parable. I think you can look all around the world and find illustrations of just how accurate Jotham was in the parable that he told. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what sort of leader? How do we know who is fit to lead? When officers go to Sandhurst, they live under a motto of serve to lead. It's not at all fashionable, is it? You know, you're not going to find people sort of going around the streets of Cuckfield or wider areas and sort of saying, you know, sort of, I'm here to serve you. Even when you go in the shop these days, it's hardly likely that anybody comes and say, I'm here to serve you. It's much more likely, what do you want? Or even much more likely, there's the machine. Well, if you have a different sort of spirit, then the consequences are going to be different too. The results will be different. And it seems to be critically important that what we need to do, all of us, not just people who come to church, but all of us, right the way through the country, is to ask questions about people who put themselves forward for leadership. And those are questions about things like integrity, concern for other people, not personal ambition, but public ambition. What is for the good of the people that I'm here to serve? And that's what Jotham is really talking about. He's really saying that this issue of who you choose to be a leader is a moral question. It's not very easy to ask moral questions these days, but it is important. And that whoever is going to be the person in whom we trust great power, in whom we trust great authority, that has to be a person whose moral integrity is beyond question. I do really think that Jotham tells a very powerful parable. But now let's bring it up to date. That's in the Old Testament. What do we meet in the New Testament? Well, I'm not going to go running all through the New Testament today, showing how Jesus sets a model for leadership which is beyond reproach and worthy of everyone to take seriously. I'll finish by reading the start of a hymn that you all know well. A beautiful hymn, I think, one that sums up in such a few words something terribly, terribly important. And to a certain extent, it includes the tree that provided the first bed for our Lord. It includes the final example of a statue that points us all to the way that we ought to live. From heaven, you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled, not to be served, but to serve. And you gave your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant king. And he calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship, the servant king.